My parents threw me out of the house, not considering me family, but when I inherited $10 million, I suddenly became important and beloved to them. I've always been the odd one out in my family. Growing up, it felt like I had to carve out my own space, almost like I didn't belong. I know it sounds dramatic, but it was a lot to deal with, especially when you're a kid just trying to find where you fit. I think it started when my mom, Linda, remarried Jim. Jim wasn't a bad guy. Really, he provided, kept to himself, and never crossed any major lines. But he just didn't make me feel like part of his family, and neither did anyone else. I have two brothers, Chad, my half-brother from Mom and Jim, and Andy, my younger brother from Mom's first marriage, just like me. Chad, of course, was Jim's pride and joy. And it wasn't exactly subtle. I can't remember a time when Jim wasn't doting over Chad, bragging about how smart and talented he was, while I sat in the background, wondering what I was lacking. To be fair, it wasn't like Mom was a saint either. She tended to side with Jim, always eager to avoid any conflict, even if it meant throwing me under the bus. Over time, I just started fading into the background, feeling more like a stranger in my own home. Andy and I had a bit of a bond. Being the youngest, he didn't get the same pressure I did. We'd play video games or hide out in my room, just talking about anything and everything, but even that started to fade. As he got older, he seemed to realize that being closer to Chad and aligning with Jim's ideas kept him out of trouble, so he started to distance himself from me. I can't say I blamed him. Andy was just trying to survive, same as I was. One night, I remember coming home late from a friend's place. I didn't think it was a big deal, just an hour or so past curfew. But as soon as I stepped in, Jim was waiting in the living room, and his face told me he'd been ready for a fight. He didn't even give me a chance to explain. "Do you think you can just waltz in here whenever you feel like it?" he snapped. I tried to keep calm, but there was a lump in my throat. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." But Jim wasn't having it. He started ranting about respect and how I was the problem child in the house. I glanced over at my mom, hoping for some backup. She just looked away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. Chad came out of his room, leaning against the wall with this smirk, enjoying the show. Andy, who was standing at the top of the stairs, looked conflicted, but he didn't say anything either. It felt like everyone was against me. And for what? For being me? For not fitting into their idea of what a good son should be? After that, I started staying away more often. I'd find any excuse to be out, studying late, joining after-school clubs, even pretending to go to a friend's house when I was just wandering around the neighborhood. Anything was better than being home. My grades started slipping, but I didn't care. My only motivation was to survive until I could get out of there. Then things got even messier when I found out my mom had been hiding something from me. I overheard her on the phone one day, talking to someone in hushed tones. I couldn't catch much, but I picked up enough to know it wasn't just a friendly chat. Curious, I started digging around, and what I found blew my mind. Turns out, my mom had been in contact with my biological dad for years, and she'd never once told me. The man I'd spent my whole life thinking was out of the picture had actually been reaching out, trying to be part of my life. When I confronted her, she acted like I was the one out of line. "I did what was best for you," she said, like that was supposed to make it all better. "Your father, he's not the man you think he is." She wouldn't give me details, just vague statements about how he had problems and that Jim was a better father figure. But I didn't want a replacement. I wanted the truth. I wanted to know why she kept him from me. After that, things between Mom and me went from bad to worse. I felt betrayed in a way I didn't even have words for. Every time I looked at her, I saw someone who'd lied to me, who'd let me suffer in silence because it was more convenient for her. The resentment just kept building, and I couldn't stop it. She and Jim didn't seem to care how isolated I felt in my own family. It was always about keeping up appearances, maintaining this image of a happy, blended family that didn't exist. I finally got a chance to meet my dad when I turned 18. Mom wasn't thrilled, but at that point, she couldn't legally stop me. He was different from what I'd expected. He had a warmth to him that I'd never experienced with Jim. My dad, Brian, was open and genuinely interested in getting to know me. He listened, which was something I wasn't used to. I told him everything, even the stuff I'd never dared to say out loud before. It was a relief, like a weight lifting off my chest. But reconnecting with him came with its own set of issues. When Jim found out, he went ballistic, accusing me of betraying the family. Mom tried to mediate, but I could tell she resented me for stirring things up. Even Andy, who had been my closest ally, started to drift away, siding with Mom and Jim. Chad, of course, had no sympathy. He saw my relationship with Dad as proof that I wasn't loyal to the family, as if I'd ever really been a part of it. Eventually, I decided to move in with my dad. It was a tough call, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I knew it would change things forever, and that I'd probably lose whatever thread of connection I still had with my mom and brothers. But I needed a fresh start. My dad's place was small, a far cry from the house I'd grown up in, but it felt more like home than anywhere else ever had. For the first time, I felt like I could just be me. No tiptoeing around, no waiting for the next argument or passive-aggressive comment. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Yet, every so often, I'd catch myself wondering if I'd made the right choice. Family is supposed to be forever, right? And I'd essentially walked away from mine. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from Andy. He sounded nervous, like he wasn't sure if he should be reaching out. Hey, Alex, he started, fumbling for words. I wanted to talk. I miss you, man. Hearing him say that made me realize how much I'd missed him, too. We talked for hours, sharing memories and laughing about things I'd almost forgotten. It felt good, but it also reminded me of what I'd left behind. After that, Andy and I started talking more often. He told me about the things happening back home, how Mom and Jim were dealing with my absence, how Chad had started acting more entitled now that I was gone. Apparently, Jim had been talking about writing me out of the will, which was no surprise, but hearing it still hurt. Andy said Mom wasn't thrilled about it, but wasn't exactly fighting for me either. The more I talked to Andy, the more I realized that my choice to leave hadn't just affected me. It had shifted the whole family dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. But as painful as it was, I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to being the invisible, unwanted son. In the end, I decided to cut ties with everyone except Andy. We kept our relationship secret, a quiet rebellion against the family that had tried so hard to push me out. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But I knew I'd finally found a place where I belonged, where I could be myself without having to apologize for it. Living under the same roof as Jim was like navigating a minefield. Every word, every glance, every tiny action was an opportunity for him to remind me that I didn't belong. My stepfather had this knack for picking up on everything he didn't like about me, every habit, every interest that didn't fit his family vision, and he didn't keep these opinions to himself. Instead, he'd make little comments, these subtle digs that sounded innocent enough to an outsider, but cut right to the core. Jim had 2 biological children with my mom, Chad and my half-sister, Lacey. Chad was only a year younger than me, and Lacey was around 12. Unlike me, they could do no wrong in Jim's eyes. He was constantly praising Chad, who was into sports and always had a stream of friends around him, and Lacey, who was the angel of the family. Jim's favorite pastime seemed to be comparing me to them, highlighting all the ways I fell short. One morning, I was eating breakfast alone in the kitchen. Jim walked in and, without so much as a greeting, started scrutinizing me. "Alex, why do you always look so withdrawn?" he said, his voice oozing disdain. "You should take a lesson from Chad. He knows how to carry himself." Chad breezed into the kitchen right on cue, grinning like he'd just won a prize. "Hey, Dad," he said, practically glowing. Jim slapped him on the back with pride, completely ignoring me as if I'd suddenly turned invisible. I glanced over at Mom, hoping she'd say something, anything to defend me. But she was busy pretending not to notice, staring hard at the newspaper in front of her as if it held the secrets of the universe. That was typical for her. She hated confrontation and would rather let Jim trample over me than risk stirring the pot. I could feel the familiar knot of resentment tightening in my chest, but I bit my tongue and went back to my breakfast. The worst part was when Jim would comment on my interests. I was always more of a reader, a quiet type, drawn to art and writing. I found comfort in my own world, a safe, place I could retreat to when everything around me felt hostile. But to Jim, these interests were strange, even threatening somehow. He'd see me sketching in my room or writing in my journal, and he'd scoff. "You need to be out there, doing something productive," he'd say, like my hobbies were a waste of time. One weekend, I'd been working on a painting I was really proud of. It was this abstract piece, with colors that seemed to dance and shift across the canvas, reflecting how I felt on my best days. I had it propped up in the corner of my room, where I could see it when I woke up. But when Jim walked in that afternoon, he barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "What is that supposed to be? Art is just, well, it's not practical, Alex. Chad's learning about business strategies. You should focus on something that has a future." Mom walked by at that moment, and I met her gaze, pleading silently for some support. She just gave me a tight smile and went about her business, unwilling to get involved. I could feel the sting of humiliation creep up my neck. It didn't matter how hard I tried to impress them. Nothing I did would ever be good enough. Jim had his favorites, and I wasn't one of them. I started spending more and more time in my room, finding solace in my art, the one place where I didn't feel like a failure. Then there was the time Jim decided to host a big family barbecue. He invited all his friends, neighbors, and even some of Chad's friends from the basketball team. As usual, I was roped into helping with the setup, while Chad and his friends sat around joking and having a good time. At one point, Chad and his buddies started messing around near the grill, and before I knew it, they'd knocked over a platter of burgers I'd just set out. When Jim came over to check on the food, he took one look at the mess and turned his fury on me. "Alex, can't you do anything right?" he spat, his voice sharp with irritation. "You're supposed to be helping, not causing more problems." I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault, that it was Chad and his friends who'd caused the spill, but Jim wasn't interested. He just shook his head and muttered something about responsibility and reliability, and again, Mom was right there, within earshot, but she didn't say a word. She just smiled nervously at the guests, acting as though everything was fine, as if her son wasn't being humiliated right in front of everyone. That was the moment I knew I was truly alone in that house. As time went on, Jim's contempt for me seemed to grow. One evening, after Chad had scored high marks on his finals, Jim threw a little celebration in his honor. He got Chad a new watch, which he presented with this big, proud speech about how he was so glad to have a son who valued hard work and dedication. I just sat there, clapping along half-heartedly, feeling more like an outsider than ever. When Jim caught my eye, he gave me a look that was almost smug, like he knew exactly how left out I felt, and he was enjoying it. The breaking point came during a family vacation. Jim had decided to take us all to a lake cabin for a week. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, but it quickly became clear that it was just another excuse for Jim to show off his perfect family. He and Chad spent the entire time fishing, taking photos together, and playing sports while I was left to entertain Lacey. Not that she wanted my company. She was Jim's daughter through and through. If Jim didn't respect me, neither did she. One evening, we were sitting around the fire pit when Jim decided to start telling stories. He went on and on about all the things Chad had accomplished, every little trophy and medal. But when he got to me, he just shrugged. "And Alex, well, he has his own way of doing things," he said, chuckling under his breath. The whole family laughed along with him, and I just sat there, feeling the humiliation settle over me like a heavy blanket. Even Mom joined in, giving me that strained, apologetic smile I'd come to hate. After that trip, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't keep living in a home where I was constantly reminded that I was an outsider, where my own mother couldn't even be bothered to stand up for me. I started saving up, planning my escape. It didn't matter where I went. Anywhere had to be better than this. I'd work, save every penny, and eventually find a place of my own, somewhere I could finally breathe. One night, as I was sitting alone in my room, Lacey walked in without knocking, her face set in a familiar look of disdain. "Why are you always hiding in here?" she sneered. "You're so weird, Alex. No wonder Dad doesn't like you." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't her fault, not really. She'd been raised to see me as the outsider, that strange one who didn't fit in. But that was the moment I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. I wasn't going to keep waiting for Mom to defend me or for Jim to finally accept me. I was done with all of it. I didn't belong here, and I was okay with that. Leaving home wasn't just a choice. It was a necessity. After graduating high school, I was convinced that I needed to forge my own path, whatever that meant. I had felt trapped in that house for so long, living under the constant scrutiny of my father, Jim, who made it clear he doubted my every decision. He always told me that moving out would be my first mistake and that the world outside wasn't as forgiving as I imagined. "You'll come crawling back," he'd say with a bitter certainty that drove me even more. But none of it mattered anymore. I had finally saved up enough from my part-time job and found an apartment downtown, far enough away to feel like a fresh start, but not so far that I couldn't reach out if I ever needed anything, though I vowed not to. So, one August morning, with my bags in the back of my old car, I left. The drive felt surreal. I was excited, but I could feel the weight of that uncertainty Jim had planted in my mind. The apartment building was nothing impressive, an aging brick structure with creaky stairs and a temperamental elevator that looked like it could fail at any minute. My apartment was small, just a single room with a tiny kitchenette and a narrow bathroom. But to me, it was a palace. There, I had complete control over my life, and I relished the solitude, knowing I didn't have to answer to anyone. My first weeks were a whirlwind of trying to adjust. I quickly realized I had taken for granted the things that once seemed trivial at home. Laundry, grocery shopping, even setting up utilities were all new territory. I spent hours figuring out how to budget, breaking down my expenses on paper, but despite my best efforts, I kept coming up short. The money I thought would last me for a few months was nearly gone within the first few weeks. It didn't take long before the charm of independence began to wear off. I was working more hours than ever before at the cafe down the street, juggling shifts to make ends meet. Most days I left the apartment before sunrise and didn't get back until late at night. I thought I'd be exhausted, but instead, I found myself unable to sleep. I was constantly worried about money, wondering if I'd make rent each month. Then, just as things started to feel like they might be manageable, everything unraveled. When I first heard about Dad's declining health, I didn't know what to feel. Jim and I hadn't spoken in months. The last time I visited him was after I'd moved out. I was still idealistic, hoping we could have a normal father-son conversation, even if it was just once. Instead, he made it clear that he was convinced I'd failed by leaving, and we hadn't spoken since. One chilly October evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my younger brother, Chad. His text was unusually formal and read, "Alex, Dad's in the hospital. Might be serious. You should come by." Chad wasn't one for pleasantries, and I figured if he'd reached out, things were probably bad. I arrived at the hospital the next morning, feeling strange walking through those sterile hallways. When I finally got to his room, it felt surreal. There was Jim, sitting up in the hospital bed, visibly weaker but still exuding that fierce pride. Chad was sitting beside him, and my older brother, Andy, leaned against the wall. I hadn't seen either of them in ages. Andy, the golden child, always the one Jim was proud of, gave me a nod but didn't bother with a smile. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," Jim said, his voice rough but unmistakably sharp. "Chad said it was serious," I replied, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. "So here I am." Dad's gaze lingered on me, as if he was assessing a stranger, not his own son. "Well, I appreciate that you made an effort," he replied dryly, and I couldn't tell if he meant it or if he was just being sarcastic. The next few days were a blur. I visited the hospital regularly, partly out of obligation and partly because Chad and Andy expected it. They were always at Jim's side, practically on shifts. It was clear that they felt as though they were fulfilling some unspoken duty. Every time I'd show up, Chad would just nod, not even bothering with the usual brotherly banter, and Andy would occasionally give me this look, as though he was trying to figure out why I was even there. One afternoon, I arrived to find Chad and Andy sitting in the hospital lobby, both looking serious. Andy was typing furiously on his phone, his face twisted in concentration. I took a seat next to Chad and waited, feeling the tension in the air. Eventually, Chad cleared his throat and looked over at me. "Listen, Alex, there's something you should know." I looked at him, confused. What is it? Dad's been working on his will, he said, glancing briefly at Andy. Given his condition, he wanted to settle things sooner rather than later. I could feel my stomach tighten. Dad had never mentioned anything about a will, and I certainly hadn't expected to be part of any inheritance discussion. It wasn't something we talked about, ever. Chad continued, hesitating. He decided to divide his assets between Andy and me. The words hit me harder than I expected. What about me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Andy put down his phone and looked at me with that familiar, calculating expression. Dad doesn't think you'd make the right choices with the money, he said bluntly. He thinks you'd waste it on whatever it is you're doing with your life. I felt a sharp sting of anger, but managed to keep it down. This was typical Jim. Even now, when he was frail and nearing the end, he couldn't see me as anything but a disappointment. So that's it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He just decided I'm out? Chad glanced away, looking uncomfortable. He thinks it's for the best, Alex. He never really understood you. You know that? For a moment, I wanted to storm out, to turn my back on all of them. But something kept me rooted in my seat. I knew that if I left now, they'd see it as proof that I didn't care, that I didn't belong. So I stayed, though every minute felt like a test of my patience and pride. In the days that followed, Dad's condition worsened, and the hospital visits became less about family bonding and more about waiting. Chad and Andy took care of most arrangements, coordinating with the doctors and the legal team handling the will. I tried to stay out of the way, not wanting to add to the tension, but I was constantly aware of how excluded I was from the decision-making. One evening, I arrived at the hospital to find Chad and Andy having a hushed conversation in the hallway. They stopped when they saw me, exchanging a glance before Chad motioned for me to join them. "We need to talk about the house," Chad said, sounding tense. I frowned, not quite understanding. "The house?" "Dad's decided to leave it to Andy," Chad explained, "along with some other assets." The news hit me like a punch in the gut. The house was where we'd all grown up, a place that held memories, both good and bad. To think that it would go to Andy without a second thought felt like another rejection. But I started, but Andy interrupted. "Look, Alex," he said in that patronizing tone I hated. "It's nothing personal. It's just practical. I've been the one taking care of Dad, dealing with all the paperwork. You haven't exactly been around." I clenched my fists, barely able to keep my anger in check. "I haven't been around because Dad pushed me away," I shot back. "He never gave me a chance." Chad sighed, looking pained. "This isn't about taking sides, Alex. It's about making sure everything's in order for Dad's wishes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if they were so absorbed in their own sense of duty that they couldn't see how unfair this all was. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my distance, but the resentment grew. I could see how Dad's favoritism had poisoned everything, turning Chad and Andy into rivals for his approval. They seemed almost obsessed with fulfilling his wishes, as if his love was something they had to earn even in his final days. Finally, one night, I confronted Dad directly. I waited until Chad and Andy had left, and then I sat by his bedside, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "Why did you leave me out?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression cold. "You wouldn't understand, Alex. You've always been different. You never followed the path I laid out for you, but I'm still your son," I replied, feeling a knot of frustration build in my chest. "Why couldn't you just accept me?" He didn't answer, simply turning away, as if my presence was too much to bear. I'll never forget the day I learned I had inherited $10 million. It was the kind of news you don't expect in your lifetime, especially not when you're someone like me, scraping by just to make ends meet, drifting from one temp job to the next after escaping my nightmare of a family. I wasn't even sure I believed it at first. The call came from a lawyer's office, someone named Samuel Porter. I didn't recognize the name and almost didn't answer, assuming it was another spam call or some scam. But something made me pick up, and it was a good thing I did. "Is this Alex?" he asked, his voice formal but with a hint of something almost excited. I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me. Yes, this is Alex," I replied, trying not to sound too curious. He introduced himself, stating he represented my Aunt Martha's estate. Now, I barely knew Aunt Martha. She was my dad's sister, someone I'd met a handful of times when I was a kid, but she'd never really been part of my life. I remembered her as a quiet, eccentric woman who kept mostly to herself. I had no idea she'd been watching from afar all these years. "Mr. Porter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "why are you calling me?" "Well, Alex," he continued, with a slight pause, "your Aunt Martha passed away recently, and as it turns out, she left her entire estate to you." I almost dropped the phone. "Her entire estate?" I echoed, feeling like I'd been yanked out of reality and into someone else's dream. He continued, explaining that Aunt Martha had left me $10 million. The words felt surreal, like they weren't meant for me, and I could barely process it. Me? The unwanted, strange kid who'd been pushed out of his own family? I hadn't even spoken to Aunt Martha in years. Why would she leave me everything she had? After a few moments of silence, Mr. Porter added, "I can understand if this is overwhelming, Alex. In fact, there are several details to go over, and I'd like to meet with you in person if that's possible. I can go through the terms of the inheritance and answer any questions you have." I couldn't bring myself to say much more than a stunned okay. So he set up a meeting, and we hung up. I sat there, staring at the wall for a good hour, the reality of it slowly sinking in. This money could change everything. I'd spent my life being belittled, made to feel small, always wishing I could just get away, build a life where I didn't feel like a failure. And now, out of nowhere, here was my chance. But with the shock and excitement came something else, a sense of confusion, even guilt. I kept wondering, why me? Aunt Martha had other nieces and nephews, children of my dad's other siblings who had stayed close to her, who hadn't been estranged or left out of the family. Why hadn't she chosen one of them? The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the lawyer's office still feeling half-dazed. Mr. Porter was a polished, middle-aged man with a crisp suit and an easy, professional smile. He welcomed me and gestured to a seat in his office. As he explained the details, I listened intently, trying to keep up. Aunt Martha's inheritance came with no strings attached, no clauses, no stipulations, no demands. She had simply chosen to leave it all to me, trusting that I would make good use of it. But as we went through the paperwork, Mr. Porter handed me a letter, folded and sealed. "She left this for you," he said gently. "I think it might explain some things." My hands were shaking as I took it from him, and I waited until I was alone later that day to read it. The letter was brief, written in Aunt Martha's neat, deliberate handwriting. She spoke of how she'd watched me struggle through my childhood, the way I was treated as an outsider. She'd seen the favoritism, the way Jim had pushed me aside, and she'd always felt a deep sadness that she hadn't stepped in sooner. "I know how hard it is to feel unwanted in your own family, Alex," she wrote. "I was once in the same position, and it almost broke me. You deserved better than what you got. This inheritance is my way of giving you a chance, one that I never had." I could hardly believe it. Aunt Martha had understood me in a way no one else in my family ever had. All those years, when I thought I was completely alone, someone had been watching, caring, even loving me from afar. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. It didn't take long for the news to spread to the rest of the family. Somehow, within days, everyone seemed to know about the inheritance. My phone lit up with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. There were texts from cousins I barely remembered, distant relatives who suddenly wanted to catch up, and even old family friends who pretended they'd always thought of me fondly. But the most shocking of all was the call from my mom. "Alex, honey," she said, her voice unusually sweet. "How are you? It's been so long." I could hear the forced warmth in her tone, the thinly veiled excitement underneath. It was clear she knew about the money. When I didn't answer right away, she cleared her throat. "I heard about Aunt Martha's passing. Such a shame. She was always so generous." The way she said it, with a hint of expectation, made me feel sick. All those years she'd ignored me, let Jim treat me like dirt, and now she wanted to play the caring mother? I cut her off before she could say more. "What do you want, Mom?" The words came out colder than I'd intended, but I didn't regret it. There was a pause, then she laughed awkwardly. "Want? Alex, I don't want anything. I just thought maybe we could talk. Reconnect. As a family. The word family stung. Where was this family when I'd needed them? But she didn't give up easily. Over the next few days, she called again, as did Jim, and even Chad. Jim, who'd barely acknowledged me as a son, left a message talking about letting bygones be bygones. Chad texted me, saying he wanted to clear the air, as if all our issues could be swept under the rug now that I had money. I deleted the messages without responding. They'd made it clear how they felt about me a long time ago. Money didn't change that. It was only Andy, my younger brother, who seemed genuinely happy for me. He called me up, and when I answered, I could hear the excitement in his voice. Alex, dude, that's amazing. I can't believe Aunt Martha left you all that. He didn't ask for anything, didn't bring up any old grudges or hint that he wanted a piece of the pie. For the first time, I felt like someone was truly happy for me, without any ulterior motives. With the inheritance in hand, I was finally free to start fresh. I bought a small place in a city far enough from the family to give me space, a place where I could finally find peace. I even invested in an art studio, something I'd always dreamed of but never thought possible. For the first time, I felt like I was building something of my own, a life where I could be myself without constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next jab or insult. But as the weeks went by, the calls kept coming. Mom tried to guilt-trip me, reminiscing about my difficult teenage years and how she'd done her best. She wanted a chance to rebuild our relationship, as if all it took was a few words to erase years of neglect. Even Lacey reached out, claiming she'd always admired me. It was obvious they'd all come to see me as their golden ticket, a means to secure their own financial future. Eventually, I changed my number, cutting off their access to me entirely. I didn't need them, and I certainly didn't owe them anything. Aunt Martha's gift was meant for me, a chance to break free from a family that had never valued me, to build a life on my own terms. I'd carry her memory with me, knowing she believed in me when no one else had. The last message I got was from Jim. It was a brief, clipped voicemail, with none of the usual charm he'd used on others to hide his true nature. Alex, you're making a mistake, he said, his voice tight with frustration. Family is family, and you can't just throw us away. You'll regret this, but I knew better. Family wasn't about blood. It was about loyalty, love, and respect, all things they'd never shown me. As I hung up and deleted the voicemail, a weight lifted from my chest. For the first time, I felt free, truly free. Aunt Martha had given me the chance I'd been dreaming of, and I wasn't going to waste it trying to make amends with people who'd never seen me as anything more than an inconvenience. It was time to start living for myself, to honor the gift she'd left me by building a life that was finally, fully mine. When my family found out about Aunt Martha's inheritance, I knew things would get messy, but I wasn't prepared for just how ugly it would get. It started off with phone calls and messages, just a few here and there. First, Mom left a voicemail, sounding casual, almost friendly. Hi, Alex. It's been a while, hasn't it? Just wanted to catch up. We should grab lunch sometime. I could tell there was something behind her words. Growing up, Mom had never been much of a warm, nurturing type. Her calls were usually brief, more out of obligation than interest. So why this sudden urge to reconnect? I ignored it, but then she called again, this time more direct. Alex, honey, we need to talk. I know you're doing well now, thanks to Aunt Martha's generosity. I just think it would be fair if you could consider helping your family, too. After all, without me, you wouldn't even have known Aunt Martha. I let out a bitter laugh at that. She'd barely spoken to Aunt Martha herself, let alone introduced me to her. I'd always thought of Aunt Martha as a distant, eccentric relative, someone Mom had all but forgotten. Now, here she was, acting like she'd been Aunt Martha's closest confidant. When I didn't respond, she escalated. One day, she showed up at my place unannounced. I opened the door, surprised and not exactly thrilled to see her standing there with a forced smile, trying to look innocent. Alex, I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by. She brushed past me, letting herself in before I could even invite her. She wandered around my apartment, looking around with a critical eye. Nice place you have here, she said, clearly unimpressed. Looks like you're doing well for yourself. I could feel the tension building. Mom, what's this really about? She dropped the smile and sighed, her tone turning sharp. Look, Alex, let's not play games. This money, it's not just yours. It belongs to the family. We all deserve a part of it. I've done so much for you, sacrificed more than you know. $1 million would make things right. It's only fair. Fair? I repeated, feeling a familiar frustration building. You think you're entitled to Aunt Martha's money? She left it to me for a reason, Mom. She didn't give it to you. Her expression hardened. Oh, so that's how you see it? After everything I did, raising you, dealing with your strangeness, you're going to turn your back on me? I shook my head, struggling to keep my voice calm. You and Jim made it clear how you felt about me. And now that I have money, suddenly I'm worth something to you? Mom's face twisted in anger. Fine, she spat, grabbing her purse. But don't be surprised if this doesn't end here. I'll see you in court if I have to. You owe me, Alex. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The next week, I received a notice in the mail. Mom and Jim were suing me, claiming they were entitled to part of the inheritance. They'd hired some shady lawyer, a guy named Vincent Crane, who had a reputation for working with people desperate to get their hands on quick money. It was ridiculous, but I couldn't take any chances. I called my own lawyer, Sam Porter, the same one who'd helped me with Aunt Martha's estate. Sam was calm, reassuring, and experienced. Don't worry, Alex, he said. I've seen cases like this before. There's no legal standing for their claim. Your aunt's will is airtight. He reviewed the documents and quickly found that Crane's arguments were flimsy, built on vague claims and emotional manipulation rather than any real legal grounds. Within days, he had enough evidence to dismiss their case entirely. But that didn't stop them. Mom and Jim started calling again, this time trying a different approach. Jim left a message, his tone dripping with feigned sympathy. Alex, we're family. This isn't how it's supposed to be. You should be looking out for us, for your brothers and sister. You're being selfish. I ignored it, but the messages kept coming. I blocked their numbers, hoping they'd get the hint. But they weren't done yet. One evening, I got a call from Andy. My heart sank when I saw his name pop up. Andy was the only one in the family I still cared about, the only one who hadn't tried to manipulate me. But I could tell from the moment he started talking that something was off. Alex, he said, hesitantly, Mom and Jim, they're really upset. They keep saying you've abandoned us. Maybe you could. I don't know. Maybe just give them a little? Just to keep the peace? Hearing those words from Andy hurt. I'd thought he understood, thought he'd seen the way they treated me. But now, even he was starting to turn against me. Andy, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, this isn't about keeping the peace. They're trying to use me. Aunt Martha left me this money because she knew what they were like. They don't care about me. They care about what I can give them. He was silent for a moment. I hate seeing the family like this, Alex. It feels like everything's falling apart. I sighed, feeling a pang of sadness. It was already broken, Andy. This just brought it to the surface. After that call, I made a decision. I was done with their manipulation, their guilt trips, their constant attempts to make me feel like I owed them something. Aunt Martha's inheritance was mine, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. I stopped answering their calls, blocked their numbers, and even filed a restraining order against Mom and Jim after they started showing up at my place, demanding money. For the first time, I felt truly free, able to focus on building a life for myself. I hired a financial advisor, a quiet, intelligent woman named Sarah who was patient with all my questions and helped me make wise investments. With her guidance, I started putting money into things I cared about. A local art studio, a scholarship fund for kids from troubled backgrounds, even a few small businesses owned by friends who'd supported me without expecting anything in return.